Uh, this is Glenn Weiss with Architectural Theory on April 15th. I currently have no one here in the classroom who could pull away from their design activities today and their presentations, and that's okay. But I am presenting this and recording it online so that other people in the class can see it if they like to, and also to give me an experience with doing a recorded presentation without any audience and see how that goes for me, as I've never done that before. So today's activities and lessons have to do with planning cities and new urbanism in particular. I'm just going to do a very quick introduction of kind of how we got to new urbanism a little bit. And the main leaders of new urbanism here in South Florida. And then we will look at that work and the result of new urbanism in South Florida. We will also have added to this discussion Leon Krier and his two planned cities in England and in Guatemala. So let's give it a shot. Here as we start the theories, these are the three main people that I'm going to talk about today. And I'm just talking briefly about Lynch and Jacobs, just to understand where they come from. So Kevin Lynch in the 1950s started to look at different ways to plan the city, especially from a kind of much more kind of the way we actually live in the city and work in the city. Rather than the kind of abstractions that had happened in modernism to divide the city into various different zones, and somehow the zones along with the roadways would make our cities. So Lynch, he looked at these elements and he started to distinguish them in terms of how a city might be put together and the way we experience the city. And you see in the image here some of his key elements in terms of understanding the city. And that is, one is the landmark, that thing which is that kind of geographic location that we understand, which is marked with some kind of device. The district, of course, we know that in many different ways, whether it's an urban district or a suburban district or a industrial district. The district itself has a kind of boundary, some kind of way in which we generally distinguish it because of its building types, because of the uses, because of the people who live there. And that is usually defined by, you can see here, an edge. So there is always an edge to the district, or a boundary as a place that is made, and that edge could be actually built up and reinforced to make sure that district is obvious to all. Within the district, we can travel and kind of under the idea of a path that we move through the district of the path. And those are different kinds of ways, whether those are automobiles or buses or subways or human beings walking on by foot. And that we, within the district, we recognize nodes. And these are the nodes which are the places of transition, which move from one place to another. And so the way that we travel and distinguish the city is that we travel on paths through districts that we understand, and we cross through those edges of the districts to know that we are in the district. We find nodes within the district in order to turn and to move and to navigate. And we use the landmarks as the main key geometric geographic location in which to orient ourselves. Because the nodes may be just instantaneous at a location, whereas the landmark has that plants like the Eiffel Tower, we're in relationship to it at a certain point and a certain view, and we understand then where we are in the city. Jane Jacobs is a different way. So she comes in the 1960s. She starts because she was very annoyed that the state of New York was planning to create a freeway that went across southern Manhattan. at the time of the construction of the great freeways throughout the United States. And as you may know, here in South Florida and other places, many neighborhoods were destroyed, neighborhoods divided in order to create the freeway and move the car quickly through our urban sprawl or suburban sprawl. And frequently, these actions were taken with a very callous methodology in which that poor neighborhoods were destroyed, and especially in here in South Florida, that would be African-American neighborhoods by I-95. So she said, this isn't going to happen. And so she developed really a way of saying we can organize as people in order to control our destiny and within our neighborhoods. So I guess really the first thing that she did was this idea that we can fight the government in relationship to urban planning and architectural design, that is not just left to the experts in which the decisions are made for the betterment of all, that we as those people who live in those places have the power and the authority to act on our own benefit and to talk to the government about how that takes place. She then also went on to write The Life and Death of Great American Cities, one of the most important books for American urbanism in the 20th century. And she had a number of ideas about how that worked, but she really saw, and this is very important for new urbanism, she saw the street as a place rather than just a way of transportation. That the street itself helped build a neighborhood because we interact with that neighborhood. We sit on the porches, we walk on the sidewalks, we look out the windows. We are part of that neighborhood in every way. And she was especially concerned in terms of kind of safety, in terms of what was happening in American cities in the 1960s. So she did invent this phrase called eyes on the street, which is that we in effect conduct our own self-observation of who belongs on the street, what they're doing on the street, and that relationship between the people who live in the space and the way they understand and view the street and participate in the street and acknowledge who is there and who is not there is in fact how we maintain the sense of a neighborhood, of knowing each other and of utilizing the street as our base, as our location for living. She was very celebrated. Some of the other things that she celebrated a lot was that density was good. It was not a negative in terms of the suburban mentality. That mixed use rather than subdividing things, so you don't have offices and then houses and then industrial and then churches. That the best thing for a neighborhood is in fact when all those things happen in one place. That you have the diversity of things and possibly in one building or multiple things in one building, which help make the density, help make what we love about a city. That the old buildings provide a character, provide a structure for the city, which should not be just demolished as though they have no value, because they do have a value in terms of our own memories and our way of seeing the street, the scale of the street, the feeling of the street, which is established by those values. And she was also very interested in short blocks, because the short blocks help make the street more into a room, more into a place where people understood this is the boundary of our mini neighborhood within, say, a district which Kevin Lynch may have created. And these ideas are very important for Duane and Zyberg-Platt. So they come together in the 1980s. They are a couple of planners, and they somehow, I don't know the whole story, ran into the developer who was planning to build a new speculative development on what became eventually known as Seaside in the panhandle of Florida, with its beautiful white sandy beaches. And so in conversation with that developer, they determined that could they in fact go back to the old idea of a city, the old ideas of making a city, rather than the suburban idea of either the gridded streets or the moving sinuously kind of move from here to there, and an isolated space which is separated by some kind of boundary in the kind of the idea of the HOA, which became so prominent in the late 60s and the 70s throughout Florida. They utilized, so they developed a series of principles, which they then called the regulating plan. So that the way that the city worked, as it did in those other suburban developments also, is that they were willing to say, let's develop a series of rules about each area and about each locations within this district, and we will actually identify those locations such that when new people build buildings, that they stay within this and maintain the character and maintain the regulating plan. You can see here is the designs here and the regulating plan. I think it's redrawn here in 2007 into the 1980s. But you can see a bunch of key things which become important to new urbanism. And that is, it begins with a kind of central place, which has the kind of urban amenities or suburban amenities that are needed. In this case, some small office buildings, some small storefronts, some post offices, some restaurants. And in that location, you have the kind of highest buildings, might go to 4 to 6 stories high in order to make that happen. That space, which is that civic space, is generally connected to whatever kind of main access you have. So in this case, this is the street that goes along the beach at Seaside, Florida. So that becomes the public space that those people who are not in the living in the development have access to the development, can park, can get out, and can walk through the development. These are not isolated places. This is back to the idea that a city is a city or a town is a town, and people visit and become part of that space. Then after you have the U-shaped central space, you have generally axes or other public spaces which kind of visually take you off of that location. Those tend to be always, and pretty much all the streets within this kind of development are not just for automobiles. They are dual use. So it's very clear that both pedestrians and automobiles belong in these spaces. But they become the key kind of architectural elements that kind of give structure to the development. And they use the kind of like the Parisian Haussmann boulevards, except at a much smaller scale. These kind of grand roads or grand spaces at this kind of mini scale, which make the organizing principles so that you know where you are and when you are. And then within these, you have different segregations. You have different kinds of places. You might have taller buildings, smaller buildings, apartments, only single family. So those are different zones within the space. And then finally, one of the things that they added, which is not typically done all the time now, but they did introduce backyard pedestrian paths, so that in the single family area, actually there's a kind of walking, you can walk and what would normally be a car alley, but it is not a car alley, it is just for pedestrians to move throughout the space. So those, we're going to see that later in another presentation regarding these kind of principles and how they were executed. Peter Calthorpe from San Francisco started to work on this in a different way, in which he called it transit-oriented development. This was, okay, guys, now we just have this kind of idea for how to shape a city, but how do we utilize that idea to reinforce our mass transit systems within the suburbs, and also a way to specify for the suburbs who are nervous about density kind of locations for density. And although this was tried in South Florida and it did not have 100% success, you have seen it. There are these kind of TOD developments in Miami. There were plans for other ones that were to take place in Palm Beach County and Broward. None of those really went forward, but what did go forward is on the main trunk lines for bus routes, et cetera. Higher density was permitted along those corridors, but not these kind of developments. And here you can see his plan. It looks very similar to Duane and Zeiderplatt in terms of their thinking, but now it's coordinated much more with a kind of regional activities or broader activities than just people who live there. So you have the core commercial and office space, which is utilized for other people who use the transit system in order to go to work and into those places. So you have a kind of density of thick city, of thick commercial and office, right? And then it's backed up with the more new urbanist plan for a residential development. Now, Duane and Zeiderplatt go on to phase 2, which I find very interesting, which is the transect. The transect is taken from environmental thinking, that is the environmental science, that, in other words, that you can see from the drawing here, which looks like kind of a mountainscape. You see the series of kind of transitions that take place. Here you have the ocean, you have the beach, you have preliminary dunes, you have tougher dunes, you have the secondary dunes, and you have the back dunes. This is their way of thinking about it at the beach, but you can take any single area in which you have this sense of transition, in which they transition between one kind of thing and the other without fully losing the sense of being in the same place. And so for them, they developed into a much more specific set of what they were calling transition spaces, these transects, so that each one had its own way to succeed successfully. And so you have like the suburban zone, the general urban zone, the urban center core, and the core. So you have each one, and you can see here on the drawings how those increase their density and their relationship to the street. Because the street is now going to become even more important in everyone's thinking because of the development now that comes out of not only Duane and Platter-Zyberg's thinking, but also other people who are engaged, that we are going to create something called form-based codes. And form-based codes, like a long time ago when Jane Jacobs said the street is the key thing, it is a public space, they totally formalized this, that the modernism had basically abandoned the space to the automobile and had set the buildings back in their green space, whether they were towers or whatever they were, or they in front of them large parking lots, which then went to the malls. So here, in order to revive the city, in order to have an exceptional city, they conceived the city, the street as a space, and so therefore develop principles for what the street would be. And so you see that here. You see this is a very typical form-based code for a street. You have the drive zones, the lanes itself, then you have maybe parking, then you have the kind of street zone, then you have the pedestrian zone, and then you have the buildings themselves and their access in and out of the space. So now the street itself, through form-based code, is creating these street spaces, hopefully for long-term success. Here you see some of those kind of methods, because although the street is the main thing, it is what you are controlling through the form-based code is not necessarily the street. You are actually controlling the building such that it helps contribute to the street that you've chosen. So here you can look at the different kind of street patterns here. In terms of one is about the kind of townhouse zone in terms of what are the setbacks on Pleasant Hill, or on the more generic work by Platter-Zyberg where you see the different kinds of zones going from the very spacious suburban zone, where the house is set back, but at least there is a porch in relationship to the street, although it may not be shaping the street, it's more suburban in that particular way, all the way down to the very bottom where you see actually the trees are now gone. And we have high density, but we do have the arcade, which is something they endorsed as a street pattern for the urban life. So you can see each of those as they move through the transect from low density to very high density to make the form-based code, to make the streets into the kind of space which are spaces which we enjoy being in, and we understand their design and their sense of us accommodating us, the human being, just not the car. So that's a kind of basic idea. So now I'm going to, we're back to Andreas and Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg in terms of, that's where I started too, back in 2006, both with the Seaside plan. And we look again now at the aerial view. We see again the central area, the spines with the diagonals coming off, and then the various districts. This was repeated again in their Windsor plan, which is a very private development. It's not like Seaside, you can't get into it. But again, you see the same differentiation. You see the axes coming off the central plan. Now it's a much more modest location. You actually have to come in off the main road and then clear the security in order to become part of this, development. And also it had much more stricter building codes related to the design. So there's a consistency of the design in relation to it. And so we're looking here is at Seaside. Here you can see the actual pedestrian walkway that was the alley behind all the buildings. The buildings are built in this kind of wooden style, but except now with metal roofs, which I guess is more hurricane proof. In Windsor, you see this kind of stucco built architecture with these wooden elements which hang off the side. This is their kind of classic way of constructing things. There was, in fact, a little bit of influence by Leon Krier in relationship to this particular development. And you can see it here in these kind of high columns in this small building at the bottom. And so then we start looking at the actual principles that are about designing them, right? And you see here what I call the half circle, the half gathering circle. This is very prevalent throughout them. The one at the right is Seaside. The one at the left is Windsor. You see the alley, especially in the alley in relationship to this axis, which comes off the central circle. And so you can see it here again in Seaside and in Windsor. These are kind of axial relationships. So you see those kind of relationships. And on the upper right-hand corner, you see the kind of community building designed by Leon Krier, one of their mentors for Platter-Zyberg as a designer and as a thinker related to this. So we have the axis. We then have, it's very interesting that in Florida, it's kind of palms as architecture. It's frequently used as a kind of repetitive pattern in which to make the sense of what is the style of the place. You can see the Seaside plan here again and its expansion. So the expansion did not really have the same strong conditions of connection. But those kind of new ways of thinking then came to Celebration at Disney World. So this was another development related to as part of Disney's creation. And Disney, instead of the half circle that welcomes you into the place, we now have a new pattern, which we'll see in other communities too, which is a kind of waterway entrance that comes through the town as you enter it, because it is more pedestrian focused, more residential focused in terms of the work. The idea of a lake, which is generally required in Florida in order to handle the extra rainwater. And that now the urban space, instead of at the entranceway, has been moved to the kind of the end, which is more private to the development, although it is publicly accessible. So you see the access. So you remember just to see, that difference. Here's Seaside, right? And then now we're at Celebration. And then finally, as another alternative is compare, we're going to compare Seaside. We're going to compare Celebration and Baldwin Park, which is in Orlando. You can see in this plan, you can see also the main consistencies, which are also true in relationship to many of these now different developments that come away from Plattersburg. You see the entranceway with the lake, which then comes down to the higher density and then into a kind of urban city space. These consistent attributes are the central canal, the 150-meter downtown. So these are like 3 blocks at the most as a downtown. There's always a wetland edge. There is half-circle parks. So you see these kind of shaped parks that take place. There are parking lots in the back. This is very important in order to reinforce the street. So now you have giant areas of parking lots behind the apartment buildings, rather than in front of the buildings in other places. There is the isolation of density. So you get the higher densities in one place, the higher densities along roadways, and then lesser densities as you move back. And this is kind of where the kind of end of the semi-private, that's what I mean by moving the downtown area, or so-called downtown area, to the end of the development. Now there is no longer, like Seaside, this ability to be part of it just by kind of driving along the road and stopping and visiting. Here are these central canals. You can see the canal here in Baldwin. Here are bridges, also a very popular aesthetic theme for these developed places with the kind of central spine of lakes. This is the 150-foot downtown, which has the kind of arcaded, which is a Plattersburg idea, arcaded space, but then with living above or offices above. But only here we're not very high in terms of the space itself, only up to 3 or 4 stories. From the streets to the back, there are passages, which are kind of old historic ways of seeing it with the arches going through to the back. And then these are the sea of parking lots, which prioritize not only prioritize where the cars are, but also what you see out your windows if you're living. In other words, that traditionally within the older apartment ideas, the view is at the back in the American model. But here, the prettier view, the more interesting view is also toward the front, which is part of, again, Jane Jacobs' idea. How do you keep people focused on the street as its location and their place? Here you start to see the 3-story apartment buildings, both in Celebration and in Baldwin Park. One of the things that happens with this particular pattern is that you really stare into the private spaces. On the first floors, there is a lot of ability to kind of see into these units that are on the first floor, because they can't afford to have zillions and zillions of miles of storefronts, so that you have this kind of use of the first floor level, and that tends to be very close, although they try to use plantings in which to keep them closed, but at the same time, they want to have the porches in which to be part of the street. So you have this ambiguous issue related to the private first floor apartments. You no longer have private backyards. Totally, backyards are given up. There is, in fact, very little, if no, private space whatsoever within these developments, other than your balcony or your porch. These, of course, these are real true amenities, these wetlands related to the park here in Baldwin. Celebration actually used their downtown spaces to hire a bunch of talented architects to do individual pieces in downtown, which makes a kind of rather than Seaside's way or the West Coast versions for TODs. You know, again, this is a more of a private activity, which makes the space special. It's not related to making a location that lots of people come to visit who are just coming to shop or to walk around. Electric vehicles are very important, in these larger developments, are permitted and allowed to exist even by state law. They do tend to shade the passageways here in Florida, so that there is a lot of tree planting specifically designed in which so that there is comfort and outdoor walking. And then there is the, once you get away from those two, so now we had Celebration and the place in Orlando. Now we have two others here in Palm Beach County, which is Mizner Park and City Place, which are designed slightly different in that Mizner Place has a great long green, which is anchored at both ends, one with the Museum of Art and a Performing Arts Center, outdoor amphitheater, and the other with larger scale stores that were supposed to be designed for large scale furniture suppliers. That didn't work out. They actually had to deal with a lot of things, whereas City Place, which is not called City Place anymore, was more of a was more like just streets with a central plaza with a historic church that was preserved as a new meeting place and theater space for lectures and talks and small performances. So here are the shopping streets for both these locations. You have the City Place on the right and Mizner Park on the left. Both of them do use the arcade as the walking space, the protected zone, which allows for space for the cars to be on the street for drive-in parking. Here's the arcades in both of them. Both of them utilize the Palm. In one, they have the Palm Court, which is the main gathering square around the former church. And in the other, you have the long green promenade, in which also, again, we see the palms as an architectural element. There is always, in these particular things in the urban zone, there is what I call the umbrella zone. This umbrella zone also exists on like Lincoln Boulevard, Lincoln Road in Miami Beach and in Coral Gables. This idea that there are the ways that you deal with the sunshine and stuff is this kind of this kind of umbrella zone where you walk up to and connect to it. Well, what happens in terms of how to facilitate and how to access this? So there are alleys which provide all the access to these buildings in order to bring in, of course, the food or the supplies to sell within these. They tend to be between a parking lot and the backs of the buildings themselves, which you're seeing here. They try to do what they can to hide the garages from the public. So one technique is to pull it back. Here you can see this at Mizner Park, in which to then plant it up with trees in order to make it not such a bad thing. But it does, there's always has to be this thing, what do you do with the cars in this case? Or these are called liner buildings. So there's only one side, they're backing into the parking garage. Actually, in some instances, people have parking, basically back access through the parking garage to their units. But these are all one-sided apartment buildings or condominiums. Here are the liner buildings at the smaller scale, which are at in Boca Raton that face the actually residential neighborhoods. It's right across the street of single family homes. There is a final development in Abacoa. It's called Abacoa. It's in Jupiter, Florida. Here you can see the plans. I think here you start to see the kind of where it kind of breaks down. Abacoa is very contained, very kind of unpleasant. Now we seem to see, instead of like a really nice street with kinds of things that you saw at both the other two places in West Palm Beach and Boca Raton, now we see this kind of very dense location in which the Palms try to mitigate the tightness of the space, which doesn't make you just want to wander and be in the location. Much more of a little urban zone, which might belong in a city and work well, but doesn't work that well just as a beginning urban zone. You can see that now the design of the exterior, and you're going to see more of this, ceases to be the kind of adding to the beauty. Here you can see now we're just looking in, but we don't have any real buffer zone in terms of the making. And now the back parking lots are even more restrictive. And now the buildings are in fact even less attractive on the back, where all the money is put on the front. You see that these instead of having the higher elevations, the kind of sense of walking down an element place, now become just a kind of minimum requirement for that. And so these kind of habits started to make me wonder about what the future was. This is in Celebration related to the future of these designs. And I should go back out, I'm sorry. In terms of I haven't gone out and rephotographed these buildings since 2006. But so also what starts to happen is that we have untalented designers practicing new urbanism, because at the beginning there was a lot of talent in relationship to the work being made. The developer packs the sites. They're using new urbanism for its density, not for the quality of the living in the space. There can be almost no open space amenities, no like wetlands, no bridges. The townhouses backs are just parking lots or driveways. You'll see some of those. Again, no semi-private outdoor spaces. And they tend to do cheap architecture without any trees, without that. So now we've gone from I call it the comparative transition from the 1980s to 2010s. New urbanism would be the same from the 1920s, in which you had this like kind of expressive, this kind of modernism, which was new, in which only high architects were involved in making nice spaces. By the time you get to the mid 1950s, it starts to go down to less talented architects just cranking out buildings. So here were a few without amenities. We have the amenity we have is a tiny swimming pool. These are the backs of the building. It's just a loop around the buildings. This is in between Boca and Delray Beach, in which there's really no reason to even be here in this space. You can see the site plans. This was the one they were forced to do, the one with the space. Originally, they wanted to do one which is just pounding them completely into the location. This is another development called Trieste in Boca Raton. Here's the plan. Now you're seeing, it's just an apartment zone that's been created with higher density, with cars and no shade, nothing to make even the street an amenity for the plans. If there is something, this I find really hilarious, this kind of like tiny pedestrian path, but it's a kind of awful path with kind of privatizing these outdoor areas between fences. I should go out and do this one. This is another one in Boca Raton. Again, just now we're just packed in. There actually is no amenity zone whatsoever. And the streets have very little. This is this is the way it looks like under construction. It doesn't improve much with the actual density. So it went from being, and here we are in the back zone. It went from being this kind of idealized neighborhoods to just a higher density way to build townhouses. And now that even the buildings are crushed against each other. So now we can look into each other's backyards. And these are just a couple that were in Delray Beach, which did have a way of kind of enhancing, especially the landscape is utilized in order to mitigate the density of them, but the backyards, just the zone for the cars become these areas, but here the pedestrian zone, which is the zone to walk, if you wish, to each other's units. But then that is mitigated by this kind of higher density, in which now we are just assuming that the city will provide this kind of amenities rather than the development itself. You can see they're completely stripped down, no decorative details, no sophisticated plantings. This is just a way to increase density. And then there has been, Plattersburg did do the aqua development, and it's worth going to see if you can get in North Miami Beach, both for the architecture, but also for the sense of developing a kind of pedestrian landscape for us. Okay. Now. But I did, before we go, I wanted to show you there were two developments by Leon Krier, which have happened much more recently and much more seriously, one in the UK and one in very recently in Guatemala. And just to show you them quickly. And let's see if it'll let me present. Yes. And now let's go to, where are you, slide share? All right, slide share. So these are Poundbury and Cayalá. And I just thought it would be interesting just to see them. I'm just going to do them very quickly. These are Leon Krier's drawings about the kind of the city and the hope for the city. So you see his transition from he calls it the city as, as parasite. But here you have the city without the suburbs, the cities with the suburbs, then the city just as suburbs. And then his recommendations that we go back to a series of suburbs. He is very much against kind of modernism in terms of his thinking. I don't really know how one is better than the other in this particular case, but he did like to make these kind of comic strips. Here he's saying this kind of bizarreness where you have these kind of buildings. He's calling 1990 a neoclassical structure with beautiful columns in his interpretation. Nobody cares about it. No one looks at it. But if it's a ruin that with the same things, then somehow it has much more value to people. So he's saying that basically we do appreciate them, we're just ignoring them. That the new city had a real city then it ruined, but then we tried to pull it back together and we didn't redesign it. We didn't rethink it, which is what he's proposing to do. That the kind of things that we really need to be part, like I am a house, call me a house. So there's a difference between what we really recognize as a roof and what we are forced to call a roof, or what is a window versus what we're calling a window. So he is arguing that these are the particular ways in which we understand and appreciate particular elements of buildings. In these developments, there's a lot more restrictions, especially in Guatemala, related to the design of the buildings, which he laid out in terms of the relationship of windows, doors, roofs, structures. Here's a way to try to get to how cars might get into these buildings and into lower areas without disrupting the pattern of the pedestrian pattern of the city. These are his ideas, his sketches for buildings in Guatemala, and how they might sit on the street. He was interested in what happens in terms of not only the style of the buildings, which you can see is very historic in terms of the making, but how it actually handles the hill and the relationship to the street, to the hill as it moves up and down in the city. Oh, I think I forgot this one was already in. This is Leon Krier's work again in Windsor and Vero Beach. This is Poundbury. Poundbury was designed by him, but also very much encouraged by now the King of England, previously the Prince, who was very much engaged in how can we bring back historically feeling spaces that people appreciate. So here you see the plan for Poundbury, which is attached to another Poundbury to the side. So you can see the kind of border edge as it goes around the space. The city does have a central axis which ties to the other cities in addition to the round space, and it makes a centralized space. So now we're not so concerned about its connection to the highways because these are a rural district. We're interested in how these spaces, both a park and an urban space, help the community build itself as a sense of identity and of enjoying those spaces. Here we have Poundbury with its central location, right? And the kind of housing style that was part of the construction. Here is the central location with this utilization of the kind of bigger buildings, the apartment buildings, maybe some office and multi-use. And then also he does Krier does like these ideas of towers, of a kind of landmarks, which form these images for the city, which bring verticality into the space. As this was built and founded during the Queen's, one of her jubilees, this is Queen Elizabeth II. I don't know how many there are in England in terms of monuments, rather than to Queen Victoria, of which there are many. Can see now these kind of open pedestrian walkways, which are not related just to, as they were in Florida, just to getting in between and out the big parking lots. And that's just part of the cut throughs. You can see the detailing of the work in which the architecture appears, I haven't been there myself, to be very highly done, not done miserably with plastic, as sometimes is done, styrofoam here in South Florida. Unique buildings, details on buildings, high craftsmanship, and fun and enjoyment outside everywhere in the city. So it's not isolated in one place. You can run across people having a good time. The backyards in many of the locations are actually actually parks, which are kind of semi-private parks. Here's another cut through. Some of the style of a simpler building. And of course, other amenities such as gardening. walking your dogs. Just a shot of construction underway. The way that the streets may end in a particular, like, iconic form and shape, which caps the end of the streets. So this is Krier actually with the developer in Guatemala, and so you're overlooking the city in Guatemala. This is an aerial view of the city, in which you can see, again, because this is tied to other connections and other sites, you really are, it's just kind of a continuation of streets in which now the heart of this is, again, like the one in England, is made a kind of central plaza, which is the gathering space. We don't see here because perhaps it's not quite the same circumstance, but you don't see as many kind of separate little parks. It's much more urban. Maybe that's a South American feeling, in which now the parks are really on the edge of the development, rather than inside the development, which we saw in Poundbury. You can see it again. And now it's kind of closer. Here's the main street with all of the requirements of Krier's requirements in terms of the design of all these buildings by the developer, which is made by one person, although there may have been more than one architect involved. And then, that these spaces have the capacity to be these main streets, to be closed down, to have those pedestrian experiences. You can see when it took place in 2000. You have to have what does it look like at night? We do have the kind of specialized lighting. That's a whole nother conversation about what we're doing. We have the historic buildings and these forms, and then we light them in this way, which would have never been lit in the past. What's that relationship? Another building. Again, in general, high quality design with concrete elements that are poured and molded. This is a church that was built in the area. And so again, using this idea, which is an idea that many people have had, the idea of the steps and the community steps and how they're utilized as a location within the city. The more lower scaled homes and developments. Another alternate view of the main street. And then one of the details from actually the building in terms of the casting. And then I just have to say these strange two pieces of public art that exist, not the Queen. Now we have I Love the City. I think this is the permanent piece of public art. And then the guy, the giant man buried in the landscape. There's a couple of artists that do this all over the world whenever they can get commissions to do them. So that's my talk on new urbanism. Thank you. That was interesting for me to try to do that. I do have a couple of more slides